The
The old
situation
man
is
sat
grave,
alone in the military
and we
courtroom,
must proceed with the
hands trembling,
utmost seriousness.
facing war crime charges for missions he ran 50 years ago. The judge leaned back, smirking, ready to humiliate him in front of a packed gallery. "Let's have some fun," the judge said, his voice dripping with mockery. "What was your call sign, old man? Rambo, G.I. Joe?" Laughter rippled through the courtroom. But when the veteran's lips moved, whispering a single word that made blood drain from the faces of older officers in the back, Hangman, the laughter died. Because legends don't stay buried, and some names carry ghosts. Where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments. If this journey of valor touched you, consider subscribing to Silent Veterans and help us give a voice to more incredible stories of our silent veterans. They called him Hangman. In the classified archives buried 3 stories beneath Langley, the name appears in redacted documents marked Eyes Only. To the men of Mac Visog, to the first Tier 1 operators who ran missions that never officially happened, it was a name spoken in hushed tones. The man who went into the jungle with a list of names and came back when the list was done. No prisoners, no witnesses, no mercy. In a courtroom in Arlington, Virginia, a military judge was about to make the mistake of asking about that name. And for the first time in 40 years, the legend would have to answer for what he'd done. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the military tribunal chamber at Joint Base Meyer-Henderson Hall, casting long shadows across the polished oak floors. Frank Dalton sat alone at the defendant's table, his 73-year-old frame upright in a royal blue suit that had seen better days but was immaculately clean. His white beard was neatly trimmed, his hands folded on the table before him, calloused fingers interlaced. He had not spoken a word since entering the courtroom 2 hours earlier. The gallery behind him was packed. Young JAG officers in their dress uniforms whispered to one another, their ribbons bright and their faces eager. A handful of reporters sat in the back row, pens poised over notebooks. In the front row on the prosecution's side sat an elderly woman in black, her eyes red-rimmed, clutching a photograph of a young Vietnamese man. Colonel Bradley Harcourt stood at the prosecution table, his Air Force dress blues crisp enough to cut glass. At 48, he was everything the modern military legal system rewarded. Ivy League educated, media savvy, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. His ribbons told the story of a career spent in courtrooms and Pentagon offices, not mud and blood. At the elevated bench, Brigadier General Thomas Mercer presided over the proceedings with the casual authority of someone who had sat in this chair 100 times before. His judicial robes hung over his army dress uniform, and his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. At 58, Mercer had built his reputation on being tough, efficient, and unimpressed by sob stories from defendants who claimed they were just following orders. Mercer rapped his gavel once, a sharp crack that silenced the murmurs. Colonel Harcourt, you may continue with your opening remarks. Harcourt rose smoothly, buttoning his jacket as he stepped around the table. Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have before us today is not a complicated case. The defendant, Mr. Frank Dalton, stands accused of war crimes committed during covert operations in Southeast Asia between 1969 and 1973. Specifically, the unlawful killing of enemy combatants who had surrendered, the execution of prisoners without trial, and the murder of civilian non-combatants. He let the words hang in the air, then walked slowly toward Dalton's table. Now, Mr. Dalton will likely argue that he was following orders, that the missions were classified, that the fog of war made moral clarity impossible. But let me be clear. Following orders is not a defense when those orders violate the Geneva Conventions. Secrecy is not a shield for murder, and the passage of time does not erase accountability. He stopped directly in front of Dalton, looking down at the old man. Mr. Dalton had a choice. He chose violence. He chose cruelty. And now, finally, after decades of hiding behind classification stamps and government protection, he will face justice. Dalton did not look up. His gaze remained fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance, his breathing slow and steady. It was a stillness that unsettled some of the younger officers in the gallery, a quality of absolute calm that suggested either complete resignation or something far more dangerous. Harcourt returned to his table and picked up a manila folder. Your Honor, at this time, I would like to enter into evidence Prosecution Exhibit J, a photograph recovered from declassified CIA files pertaining to Operation Prairie Fire, conducted in Laos in 1971. He opened the folder and withdrew an 8x10 black and white photograph, walking it over to the bench. Mercer took it, glanced at it briefly, and nodded. Admitted. Harcourt then turned and walked to Dalton's table, placing the photograph face up directly in front of him. Mr. Dalton, would you please describe for the court what is depicted in this image? For the first time that morning, Dalton moved. His eyes dropped to the photograph. The room seemed to hold its breath. The image was grainy, the contrast harsh in the way of old film stock. It showed a young man in jungle fatigues, his face lean and hard, holding a CAR-15 rifle. He stood on the bank of a muddy river, and at his feet lay 4 bodies covered with ponchos. Behind him, the jungle was a wall of green, and smoke rose from somewhere out of frame. Dalton's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His fingers, still folded on the table, pressed together just a fraction harder. Harcourt leaned in, his voice loud enough for the entire gallery to hear. That's you, isn't it, Mr. Dalton? 28 years old, standing over the bodies of men you killed. Mercer leaned back in his chair, removing his glasses and cleaning them with a cloth from his robe pocket. He had been watching the exchange with the faint amusement of someone enjoying a one-sided fight. Now he decided it was time to weigh in. Mr. Dalton, I have to say, I've presided over a lot of cases in my career, and I've noticed a pattern. Every time a defendant claims to have been involved in classified missions, it usually turns out their service record is so unremarkable that nobody bothered to document it properly. Classified becomes a convenient excuse for a career that was, frankly, mediocre. A few of the younger officers in the gallery chuckled. Harcourt allowed himself a small smile. Mercer folded his hands on the bench. But let's humor this, shall we? For the record, Mr. Dalton, I see here that you've listed your rank as Sergeant First Class and your unit as, well, it just says classified. He made air quotes with his fingers, drawing more quiet laughter. But apparently you had a call sign, some kind of operational nickname. Now, I'll be honest with you, Mr. Dalton. In my experience, these call signs are usually pretty silly. I once had a defendant who called himself the Hammer. Turned out he'd spent most of his deployment fixing plumbing in Saigon. More laughter now, louder. Mercer was enjoying himself. So, for the sake of completeness, let's get this on the record. He leaned forward, his tone shifting to one of mocking indulgence. What was your call sign, Mr. Dalton? Rambo? Terminator? The Lone Ranger? He tapped his gavel lightly, a punctuation mark to the joke. Come on, Mr. Dalton. Entertain the court. What was your big, scary war nickname? The room waited. Dalton's face was unreadable, but something in his posture had shifted. His shoulders, already straight, seemed to settle even further, as if bracing against a weight only he could feel. Harcourt, sensing the moment, stood up. Your Honor, the defendant is under oath. He needs to answer. Indeed, Mercer agreed, his voice still laced with sarcasm. Mr. Dalton, this is a simple question. What was your call sign? Dalton's fingers finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and touched the edge of the photograph on the table. His thumb brushed the corner where the image was creased and faded. When he spoke, his voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it carried through the silent courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. Hangman. The word hung in the air. Mercer's smile faltered, just for a second before he recovered. Hangman, he repeated, trying to inject the word with the same mockery, but somehow it didn't land the same way. Well, that's certainly dramatic. Dalton's thumb pressed against the photograph. His eyes closed, and the world dissolved. The humid air of Laos hit him like a physical blow, thick and suffocating, carrying the smell of rotting vegetation and stagnant water. The polished courtroom vanished. replaced by the green hell of triple canopy jungle. Frank Dalton was 19 again, and the weight on his back wasn't the judgment of a court. It was 60 pounds of gear, ammunition, and the knowledge that he was about to walk into a place where the Geneva Conventions were just words on paper that nobody had bothered to bring. It was March 1971, and the war that didn't officially exist was about to get worse. The Huey banked hard over the Zekong River, its rotor wash flattening the elephant grass below. Dalton sat in the open door, his car 15 across his lap, watching the jungle slide past in shades of green that all looked the same until you learned to read them. Beside him sat the rest of Recon Team Python, 6 men who weren't supposed to exist, running missions into a country America swore it wasn't operating in. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, the team leader, Corporal Ty Washington, the radio operator, Specialist Eddie Vance, the medic, Lance Corporal Jimmy Duarte, the point man, Sergeant Billy Raines, the assistant team leader, and Dalton, the new guy, the one they'd started calling Hangman 3 months ago. The pilot's voice crackled through the headset. 2 minutes to LZ. It's gonna be hot, boys. We've got reports of NVA movement in the area. You're going in fast and dirty. Webb gave a thumbs up and turned to the team, shouting over the rotor noise. Rules of engagement are the same as always. There aren't any. Target package is Charlie 7. 4 high-value Pathet Lao officers operating out of a command post 3 clicks northwest of the border. Intel says they're coordinating attacks on Hmong villages. We go in quiet. We verify. We call it in. And if possible, we bring one back for questioning. The jungle below suddenly opened into a small clearing. The helicopter didn't land. It couldn't. Not here. Not with the LZ unsecured. Instead, it dropped to 6 feet off the ground, and the team fast roped out in less than 10 seconds. Dalton hit the mud and went immediately to one knee, weapon up, scanning the tree line. And then there was silence. The kind of silence that wasn't really silence at all, but 1,000 small sounds layered on top of each other. Insects buzzing, birds calling, branches creaking in the wet heat. Webb hand-signaled the formation. Duarte took point, moving with the careful, deliberate steps of a man walking through a minefield. 3 hours into the patrol, Duarte raised a fist. Everyone froze. He pointed to his ear, then gestured ahead. Voices, faint, but definitely human. Definitely not English. Webb moved forward, listened, then waved the team into a defensive perimeter. He pulled out a map and a grease pencil, marking their position, then keyed his radio. Python to Covey, we have audible contact. Multiple voices, estimated 20 to 30 meters northeast. Requesting surveillance pass, over. The response was immediate. Negative. Python, air assets are committed elsewhere. You're on your own for the next 4 hours. Observe and report. Do not, repeat, do not engage unless compromised. The team crept forward, moving through the undergrowth with agonizing slowness. Through the thick vegetation, Dalton caught glimpses of movement. Then the jungle opened slightly, and he saw it. A small clearing with 3 bamboo huts and a larger structure that looked like a command post. Standing around a table were 4 men in the dark green uniforms of Pathet Lao officers. Target package Charlie 7. Confirmed. But there was a problem. Surrounding the clearing were at least 20 soldiers, maybe more. Webb pulled the team back 50 meters. We can't take them, not with this many. We call it in, we mark the coordinates, and we get the hell out. Washington was already setting up the radio when the world exploded. The ambush came from 3 sides at once. The first burst of AK fire tore through the jungle. Duarte went down immediately, clutching his leg and screaming. Vance, the medic, threw himself toward Duarte and took 2 rounds in the back before he hit the ground. Contact front, contact left. Webb was shouting into the radio, firing controlled bursts toward muzzle flashes in the trees. Dalton rolled behind a fallen log, returning fire. The jungle was alive with sound now, AK-47s chattering, M16s barking in response, men screaming. Billy Raines crawled over to Dalton's position, his face smeared with mud and blood. They're flanking us. We stay here, we're dead. Webb made the call. Python, we're moving. Duarte, can you walk? Duarte, pale and gritting his teeth, nodded. Vance didn't respond. He was face down in the mud, unmoving. Leave him, Webb ordered. The team began to fall back, firing and moving in pairs. That's when Webb went down. He was covering their retreat when a burst caught him across the chest. He dropped like a puppet with its strings cut. Rains and Dalton both moved toward him. Rains got there first, rolling Webb onto his back. The team leader's eyes were wide, blood bubbling from his lips. Webb, stay with me, Rains was shouting, but even as he said it, they both knew. Webb grabbed Rains's collar, pulling him close. The mission? Charlie 7. Can't let them. Coordinate. More attacks. Forget the mission. We're getting out of here. No, you get them out. Dalton finishes it. And then he was gone. Rains looked at Dalton, and in that moment, an entire conversation happened without words. The mission was still viable. The target was still there. If they extracted and called in an airstrike, it would be ours, and by then the Pathet Lao officers would be gone. More villages would be attacked. More civilians would die, unless someone went back. I'll do it, Dalton said. The hell you will. I'm senior. It's my call. You're wounded. You need to get Duarte to the extract. I'll finish the job and meet you at Rally Point Bravo. They both knew it was a lie. Rains hesitated for 1 second, then nodded. He grabbed Webb's dog tags, pressed them into Dalton's hand, then turned and moved toward Washington and Duarte. 30 minutes. You're not at the rally point in 30 minutes and we're gone. Dalton moved through the jungle like a ghost, using the enemy's own noise to mask his movement. It took him 20 minutes to circle around to the far side of the clearing. The 4 officers were still there, now arguing with each other. Dalton settled into a firing position behind a fallen tree. Through the simple iron sights, he watched the officers. He could take 2, maybe 3 before they scattered. But he needed all 4. That was the mission. He waited. Patience was a weapon, too. 10 minutes later, the clearing started to empty. Soon there were only 8 men left. Then 6. Then, finally, just the 4 officers and 2 guards. Dalton didn't think. Thinking got you killed. He simply acted. The first shot dropped the guard on the left. The second dropped the guard on the right. Before either body hit the ground, he shifted to the officers. 4 shots. 4 seconds. Then he was moving, sprinting across the clearing. He grabbed the documents from the table, stuffed them into his pack, then turned to run. That's when the mortar round landed. He didn't hear it coming. You never did. 1 second he was running, and the next the world was a wall of sound and heat and pressure. The blast picked him up and threw him like a toy, slamming him into a tree. He felt something tear in his back, felt wetness spreading across his uniform. He forced himself to his feet. His legs barely worked. His rifle was gone, but he had his sidearm, and he had the documents. The mission was complete. The jungle tilted and spun as he stumbled forward. Then he heard it, the sound of a Huey, the most beautiful sound in the world. He broke through the tree line into Rally Point Bravo. The helicopter was already there, hovering, and he could see Rains leaning out of the door, waving frantically. Oh, come on, move, move. Dalton ran, or tried to. His legs gave out halfway across the clearing. Enemy fire erupted from the jungle behind him. Then Rains was there, grabbing him, dragging him. Washington jumped out to help, and together they threw Dalton into the helicopter. Dalton lay on the floor of the Huey, staring at the ceiling, his ears ringing. He could feel hands on him, trying to stop the bleeding. You did it, Rains was saying. You crazy son of a bitch, you actually did it. But before they carried him away, he felt someone press something into his palm. He looked up through blurred vision and saw a colonel standing over him. The colonel was holding something small and jagged. They pulled this out of your back, son, piece of that mortar. 3 inches to the left and you'd be dead. He pressed the chunk of shrapnel into Dalton's hand. The mission you ran, it didn't happen, you were never there, but I want you to have this. So you remember, so you know that what you did mattered. The colonel leaned closer. What's your name, son? And Dalton, half delirious. gave the only answer he could think of. "Hangman, sir. They call me Hangman." The memory shattered like glass, and Frank Dalton was back in the courtroom. The jungle heat was gone, replaced by the sterile air conditioning of the tribunal chamber. But his hand was still pressed against the photograph on the table, and his face was wet with tears he hadn't realized he'd shed. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Brigadier General Mercer was no longer smiling. The laughter from the gallery was gone. A few of the older officers in the back were sitting straighter, their faces suddenly uncertain. The doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with a force that made the bailiff jump. Every head turned. The sound came first. Boots on marble, moving fast and purposeful. Then the visual. 2 military police officers in dress uniforms entering first, followed immediately by a full colonel. But it was the figure behind them that made the entire courtroom freeze. General Curtis Wade was 68 years old, but he moved like a man 20 years younger. 4 silver stars gleamed on each shoulder of his dress uniform. His chest bore ribbons that read like a history of American military operations over the past 4 decades. He walked past the gallery without acknowledging anyone, his focus locked on a single point. He walked until he reached the defendant's table. He stopped precisely 3 feet in front of Frank Dalton. Wade's hand snapped up in the sharpest, most perfectly executed salute the courtroom had ever witnessed. "Mr. Dalton," Wade's voice boomed across the chamber. "It is an honor, sir." The words fell like a bomb. Mercer's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Harcourt's face drained of color. Wade held the salute for a full 5 seconds before finally dropping his hand. But he didn't step back. He stood at attention in front of Dalton, a 4-star general showing deference to an old man in a threadbare suit. Harcourt found his voice first, though it came out higher and thinner than he intended. "General Wade, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this man is on trial for war crimes. He doesn't deserve—" Wade's head turned slowly, his gaze fixing on Harcourt. "Colonel, you will be silent." Harcourt's mouth snapped shut. Wade turned back to the courtroom at large. "Ladies and gentlemen, 20 minutes ago I was in a classified briefing at the Pentagon when I received a phone call. I dismissed my entire staff, commandeered a helicopter, and flew here at maximum speed. Some of you may be wondering why. Let me enlighten you." He gestured to Dalton. "For those of you who don't know, and clearly, that includes the 2 officers running this farce of a trial, let me tell you who you're looking at. You see an old man in a worn suit. I see a giant. This is Frank Dalton. To the men of MacVsog, to the first operators of Delta Force, he was known by another name, Hangman." The name reverberated through the chamber. Several of the older officers suddenly sat up straighter. The call sign wasn't a joke. It was a designation given to one man in the entire United States military, who was authorized to conduct solo targeted elimination operations against high-value enemy commanders in denied territory. He began to pace. When a target was too important to miss, too dangerous to approach with a full team, too time-sensitive to wait for a strike package, they sent Hangman, alone, always alone. Wade stopped and turned to face Mercer directly. "General Mercer, you asked him about his call sign. You laughed. You made jokes. Let me tell you what you just mocked. Between 1969 and 1973, Hangman conducted 47 solo operations. 47 times, he completed his mission, and 47 times he came home." He pointed at the photograph. "That photograph you're using as evidence of murder. Let me tell you what it really shows. That mission in Laos was targeting a Pathet Lao command cell responsible for coordinating attacks on Umang villages. 3 weeks before that photo was taken, those 4 officers orchestrated a massacre of over 300 civilians, including 80 children under the age of 10. Wade's voice hardened. Sergeant Dalton's team was ambushed. 2 men killed, 2 wounded. Standard operating procedure would have been to abort and extract, but by the next day those officers would have been gone. More villages would have been attacked. More children would have died. So this man made a choice. He sent his wounded teammates to the extraction point, then went back alone. He infiltrated an enemy camp that was fully alert. He eliminated the targets. And then he was caught in a mortar blast that embedded 43 pieces of shrapnel in his back. Pieces that are still there, that he has carried for 54 years. The general walked over to the prosecution table and snatched up the photograph. You want to call this murder? This is what saved 3 Hmong villages from annihilation. This is what prevented the deaths of hundreds of civilians. He turned to Harcourt. You, Colonel, have the audacity to accuse this man of war crimes. You, who have never heard a shot fired in anger. Every one of Hangman's operations was authorized by the National Command Authority. Every target was vetted and approved by the Secretary of Defense. He stepped closer. You want to put him on trial? Then put me on trial. Because I was there. I was a lieutenant on one of those missions. And when it went sideways, Hangman pulled me out of a burning helicopter. I owe my life to this man. Wade turned back to Mercer. General Mercer, you asked for his call sign as a joke. You wanted to humiliate him. Let me tell you what that call sign really means. Hangman wasn't about killing. It was about what happened when enemy commanders heard the name. Radio intercepts show that the mere rumor of Hangman being in an area caused officers to abandon positions. The call sign became a psychological weapon. He looked back at Dalton. But the name also meant something else. The Hangman was the man who carried out society's justice. The man who did the necessary thing so that others wouldn't have to. The man who bore the moral weight so the community could sleep at night with clean hands. That's what Frank Dalton was. That's what he still is. A man who carried the darkness so the rest of us could walk in the light. The silence that followed was profound. Several of the older officers in the gallery had tears in their eyes. Mercer slowly sat down, his face ashen. Wade turned to Harcourt one last time. Colonel Harcourt, you have built a career on prosecuting veterans. You call it accountability. I call it cowardice. It's easy to stand in a courtroom 50 years later and judge men for decisions they made when they were 19. But here's what you don't understand. Men like Frank Dalton didn't fight for your approval. They fought so that people like you could sit in comfortable offices and philosophize about morality. You owe him everything. He turned to Mercer. Your Honor, I am formally requesting that all charges be dismissed immediately. Mercer looked at Harcourt. Colonel Harcourt, do you wish to continue with this prosecution? The silence stretched. Finally, Harcourt shook his head mutely. Speak up, Colonel, Wade said coldly. Harcourt's voice came out as barely a whisper. No, Your Honor. The prosecution withdraws all charges. Mercer picked up his gavel with a trembling hand. All charges against Frank Dalton are hereby dismissed. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell with a single, hollow crack. Dalton finally rose from his chair. He turned to face Wade, and for a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other. Curtis, Dalton said quietly, you didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. I owed you that much. Before Dalton could respond, Colonel Harcourt approached. His face was pale, his hands clasped like a penitent. Mr. Dalton, I built this case on documents. Reports. I thought I was pursuing justice. I never asked what the mission was. I never questioned why you were there. His voice cracked. I'm sorry. Dalton studied Harcourt for a long moment. Colonel, you were doing what you thought was right. But here's what you need to understand. The law is not always the same as justice. There are things done in the shadows so that others can live in the light. You can judge those actions from the safety of your courtroom, but until you've carried a dying brother through a jungle while the enemy closes in, you don't get to decide what honor means. He placed a hand on Harcourt's shoulder. Learn from this. Don't let it destroy you. Let it teach you. There's a difference between accountability and persecution, between justice and revenge. Harcourt nodded, unable to speak, and walked out of the courtroom. 2 weeks after the trial, the Secretary of Defense convened a special review board. The policy was formalized 6 months later as Department of Defense Directive 5210-67, but within the military, it became known by another name, the Dalton Precedent. 8 months after the trial, Colonel Harcourt found himself at a Veterans Affairs hospital. He was reviewing case files when he saw Frank Dalton in the hallway, waiting for a routine appointment. Harcourt approached, Mr. Dalton, I've spent the last 8 months reading files, learning about missions that never officially happened. I was wrong. Not just about your case, about all of it. Dalton nodded slowly. That's good work, Colonel. Those men need someone to fight for them. Dalton reached into his jacket and pulled out something small. The piece of shrapnel. I want you to have this. I lived it. I don't need a piece of metal to remember, but you need something to help you understand what it really cost. When you're helping those veterans, hold this. Remember that every one of those men carries something like this. Harcourt's hand closed around the shrapnel. Don't let guilt destroy you. Use it. Let it make you better. Frank Dalton lived 6 more years. When he died peacefully in his sleep at 91, his funeral was attended by 36 men he'd saved and more generals than most people see in a lifetime. At the burial, General Wade stood at the graveside and spoke the words that would be carved into Dalton's headstone. He walked into darkness so others could live in the light. He carried burdens no one should have to bear. He was, in every sense that matters, the best of us. Colonel Harcourt, now in his 70s, held the piece of shrapnel. When the ceremony ended, he approached the grave alone. He knelt, placed the shrapnel on the fresh earth, and spoke quietly. Thank you for teaching me what honor really means. The wind carried his words away, across the mountains, into the vast silence where all soldiers eventually go. And somewhere in that silence, the men who had walked into darkness together could finally rest, their duty done, their burden laid down, their names remembered by those who understood what they had given. If you were moved by Frank Dalton's story of quiet courage and the weight of necessary sacrifice, please like this video, share it with someone who respects our veterans, and subscribe to Silent Veterans for more stories of the unassuming heroes who walk among us.